The morning arrived softly in the coastal town of Bellhaven, where the fog rolled in from the ocean like a gentle blanket, wrapping itself around the small storefronts and weathered buildings that lined Harborview Street. The air smelled of salt and cedar, of rain-soaked earth and the faint sweetness of wild roses that climbed the fences along the residential blocks. It was the kind of town where people knew each other's names, where the pace of life moved slowly, deliberately, like the tide itself, and where the rhythm of days followed the patterns of seasons that had been observed for generations. In a small apartment above a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread drifted upward through the floorboards each morning, a man named Dmitry Volkov stood at his kitchen window, holding a ceramic mug between his palms, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. The mug was chipped along the rim, a pale blue color that had faded over years of use, and it had traveled with him across an ocean, packed carefully in a box of belongings that represented everything he owned in the world. He had arrived in this country 5 years ago, carrying hope in his heart and calloused hands that knew the language of hard work, even when his tongue still stumbled over English words that tangled themselves in unfamiliar patterns. Dmitry was a man of 43, with broad shoulders that carried both strength and weariness, with dark hair threaded with silver at the temples, and with eyes the color of storm clouds over water. His face was kind, marked by lines that spoke of smiling more than frowning, though life had given him reasons for both. He wore simple clothes, a wool sweater with patches at the elbows, work pants that had been mended multiple times, and boots that had walked many miles. There was a gentleness in his movements, a thoughtfulness in the way he occupied space, as though he was always aware of not taking up too much room, of not imposing himself too heavily on the world around him. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with second-hand furniture that he had collected piece by piece from thrift stores and yard sales. A threadbare sofa sat against one wall, covered with a knitted blanket in shades of cream and brown. A wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by countless meals, scattered now with sketches and drawings, blueprints, and calculations written in careful handwriting. Books lined makeshift shelves, some in English, some in Russian, their spines creased and comfortable. A small lamp with a brass base cast warm light into the room during the evening hours, creating shadows that felt companionable rather than lonely. Outside the window, Bellhaven was beginning to wake. The bakery below opened its doors, and the owner, Mrs. Chen, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands dusted perpetually with flour, waved up at Dmitry as she did every morning. He waved back, a small gesture of connection that had become part of his daily routine, a reminder that he was seen, that he belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere still felt fragile, temporary, like something that could disappear if he didn't hold on to it carefully enough. Dmitry had come to this country with dreams that felt both impossibly large and achingly simple. He wanted to build things, to create structures that would last, to use his hands and his mind to craft something meaningful. In his homeland, he had been a carpenter and a craftsman, known in his village for the furniture he built, for the houses he helped construct, for the careful attention he paid to every joint, every corner, every detail. But circumstances had shifted, opportunities had narrowed, and he had made the difficult choice to leave, to start over, to rebuild his life in a place where everything felt unfamiliar, where even the rhythm of speech was different, where he was always translating, always adjusting, always trying to find his footing on uncertain ground. The past 5 years had been a slow accumulation of small steps forward. He had worked construction jobs, framing houses in the summer heat, his back aching by evening, his hands blistered and raw. He had learned the building codes of this new place, studied the regulations and requirements, practiced his English with patient coworkers who corrected his grammar kindly and showed him how things were done here. He had saved money carefully, living frugally, eating simply, setting aside every spare dollar in a coffee tin that he kept on the highest shelf of his kitchen cabinet. The tin grew heavier slowly, a tangible weight of possibility, of future plans taking shape coin by coin, bill by bill. What Dmitry wanted, what he dreamed about in the quiet hours before sleep, was to start his own small business. Not something grand or ambitious, just a workshop where he could build custom furniture, repair old pieces that others had discarded, create beautiful things from wood that had been sustainably sourced, that honored both craft and environment. He had found a property on the edge of town, an old garage that sat empty on a corner lot, its windows dusty and its roof in need of repair, but with good bones, with potential. The owner was willing to lease it for a reasonable price, and Dmitry had walked through the space dozens of times, seeing not what it was, but what it could become. He could picture the workbenches along the walls, the tools hanging in organized rows, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, the satisfaction of creating something with his own hands that would bring beauty and utility into someone's home. But to make this dream real, he needed a loan. Not a large one, just enough to cover the first few months of rent, to purchase essential tools, to buy materials, to create a small buffer while the business found its feet. He had prepared his application carefully, gathering every piece of documentation, every bank statement, every reference. Letter from employers who had praised his work ethic and reliability. He had practiced what he would say, rehearsed his explanations, tried to anticipate every question that might be asked. And on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday, with the fog still lingering and the sound of gulls calling over the harbor, he had walked into the Bellhaven Community Bank, his documents in a folder under his arm, his heart beating with a mixture of hope and nervousness that made his palms damp. The bank was located in a brick building that had stood on Main Street for over a century, its interior cool and quiet, with high ceilings and wooden counters that had been polished by decades of hands. Soft music played from hidden speakers, something classical and soothing, and the air smelled faintly of paper and carpet and the coffee that someone had brewed in a back office. Dmitri approached the reception desk, where a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Jennifer greeted him with a smile. She directed him to wait in a small seating area where leather chairs worn soft with age surrounded a low table covered with magazines about homes and gardens. Dmitri sat, his folder on his lap, his hands folded over it, and he waited with the patience of someone who had learned that most good things required waiting, that rushing rarely helped, that time moved at its own pace regardless of how urgently you wished it forward. After 15 minutes, a man emerged from an office and called his name. His name sounded different in this man's accent, the syllables not quite right, but Dmitri stood and followed him into a windowless room with beige walls and a desk covered with neat stacks of paper. The man introduced himself as Richard Pemberton, senior loan officer, and he shook Dmitri's hand with a grip that was firm but brief, professional but not particularly warm. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair combed carefully over a balding crown, with a suit that looked expensive but tired, and with eyes that seemed to assess everything quickly, efficiently, making calculations and judgments with practiced ease. Dmitri sat across from him and explained his situation. He spoke slowly, carefully, his accent thick but his words clear. He described his work history, his savings, his plan for the business. He showed his documents, each one organized and labeled, evidence of responsibility and preparation. He talked about the furniture he wanted to build, the community he wanted to serve, the way he believed there was a market for handcrafted, durable pieces in a world that had grown too accustomed to disposable things. His passion was evident in his voice, even through the language barrier, even through the nervousness that made his hands shake slightly as he pointed to his sketches, to his budget projections, to the letters of support from potential customers who had already expressed interest in his work. Richard Pemberton listened with an expression that gave nothing away. He nodded occasionally, made notes on a legal pad, asked questions about income and credit history and collateral. His tone was neutral, professional, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply methodical, processing information according to procedures and protocols that had been established long before this particular conversation, that would continue long after it ended. When Dmitri finished explaining, when all his documents were spread across the desk like offerings, there was a moment of silence. Richard gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligned their edges with precise movements, and then he folded his hands on top of them. He cleared his throat softly, a preparatory sound, and then he spoke in a voice that was practiced at delivering difficult news gently, that had learned how to be both firm and kind, though the firmness always won in the end. He explained that while Dmitri's application showed initiative and dedication, there were concerns. The length of time in the country, while substantial, was still not as long as they typically preferred. The credit history, though clean, was thin, without the deep roots that demonstrated long-term stability. The business plan, while thoughtful, was in a field that already had established competitors, and the risk assessment suggested that new small businesses in this sector had high failure rates. The collateral offered was minimal, and the loan-to-income ratio was higher than their standard guidelines allowed. He spoke in paragraphs that felt rehearsed, that wrapped denial in layers of reasonable-sounding explanations that made it seem as though the decision was inevitable, impersonal, simply a matter of numbers and policies rather than judgment about a person's worth or potential. Dmitri listened with a sinking feeling in his chest, a heaviness that settled there like a stone dropping into still water. He had expected this, in some part of his mind, had prepared himself for disappointment because disappointment was familiar, because he had learned not to count on things working out easily. But hoping and expecting were different things, and the hope had been real, bright, insistent, and now it was dimming, fading, being replaced by a quiet ache that he knew would stay with him for days, weeks, maybe longer. He asked in his careful English if there was anything he could do, any additional information he could provide, any way to reconsider. Richard shook his head gently, sympathetically, explaining that the decision was based on established criteria, that exceptions were rarely made, that perhaps in another year or two, with more established credit, with more savings, the application might be viewed differently. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting, and he shook Dmitri's hand again, wished him luck, and showed him to the door with the kind of polite finality that left no room for argument or appeal. Dmitri walked out of the bank into the soft light of midday, into the gentle bustle of Main Street where people moved about their errands, where life continued its ordinary rhythms regardless of his personal disappointment. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, his folder still under his arm, his dream still intact, but the path to them suddenly blocked, obscured, requiring a detour he hadn't planned for. The fog had lifted, and the sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that moved slowly overhead. Seagulls wheeled above the harbor, their cries carrying on the breeze, and somewhere nearby a dog barked, and a car horn honked gently, and the world kept turning, as it always did, indifferent to individual setbacks, to personal struggles, to the quiet disappointments that marked ordinary lives. He walked slowly back toward his apartment, his feet carrying him along familiar streets, past the hardware store where he sometimes browsed the tool section, past the library where he had checked out books on business management and furniture design, past the small park where he occasionally sat on a bench during his lunch breaks, eating sandwiches he had packed in reused containers, watching children play on swings while their parents called to them in voices full of love and gentle warnings. The town was beautiful in its simplicity, in its unhurried pace, and he had grown to love it here, to feel that it could become home. Truly home, if only he could find a way to establish himself more permanently, to plant roots that went deeper than temporary jobs and rental apartments. When he reached his building, he climbed the stairs slowly, his legs heavy with more than physical tiredness, and he let himself into his small space where the afternoon light was streaming through the windows, making patterns on the worn carpet. He set his folder on the table, and he sat in the chair that faced the window, and he let himself feel the disappointment fully, allowed it to wash over him without trying to push it away or minimize it. He was good at this, at sitting with difficult feelings, at acknowledging them without being destroyed by them, at letting them exist while also holding on to the knowledge that feelings were temporary, that they would shift and change, that tomorrow would bring a new day with new possibilities, even if those possibilities looked different from what he had imagined. The afternoon passed quietly. Dmitri made himself tea, the ritual of boiling water and steeping leaves providing a small comfort, a moment of mindfulness in the midst of uncertainty. He looked at his sketches again, at the drawings of tables and chairs and cabinets that he had labored over, refining proportions and joinery details until they felt right. These drawings were precious to him, more valuable than the furniture itself would be, because they represented his vision, his creativity, his way of seeing the world, and his place in it. And the bank's rejection did not erase this vision, did not make it less real or less worthy, even if it made the path forward less clear. As evening approached, as the light began to soften and golden, Dmitri made a decision that felt both like giving up and like refusing to give up, a paradoxical resolution that somehow made perfect sense. If he could not secure a loan to lease the space and buy tools, then he would find another way. He would start smaller, more gradually, building from what he already had rather than waiting for permission or approval from institutions that did not know him, that could not see what he saw, that measured worth in numbers and credit scores rather than in character and commitment. He had some tools already, collected over years, stored in a corner of his apartment. He had his skills, his knowledge, his years of experience. He had time, evenings and weekends when he was not working his construction job, and he had materials or access to them, wood that was discarded from building sites, pieces that others considered scrap but that he could see potential in, that could be transformed into something beautiful with patience and care. He began that very evening, moving the furniture in his small living space to create a makeshift workshop area. He spread a canvas drop cloth on the floor to protect it from sawdust and spills. He brought out his tools, laid them carefully on a folding table, organized them the way he liked, each one in its place, ready for use. He selected a piece of reclaimed oak that he had been saving, a beautiful board with rich grain and warmth, salvaged from a barn that was being demolished outside of town. He had planned to use it for something special, and now seemed like the right time. He began to work, his hands remembering motions they had performed thousands of times, his body settling into the familiar rhythm of crafting. He measured carefully, marked lines with a carpenter's pencil, cut with a handsaw that whispered through the wood with satisfying resistance. The apartment filled with the smell of fresh sawdust, with the gentle sounds of work, with the focused energy of creation. And as he worked, something shifted inside him, a subtle but profound change, a movement from disappointment toward determination, from feeling defeated toward feeling empowered, from waiting for someone else to give him permission toward granting permission to himself. The evening deepened, and the apartment grew dark except for the circle of light from his work lamp. Dmitri continued, unhurried, present with each cut, each joint, each detail. He was building a small side table, something elegant and simple, with clean lines and thoughtful proportions. It was modest in scale, but not in ambition, crafted with the same care and attention he would give to a commissioned piece for a wealthy client, because the value of the work was not determined by who would own it, but by the integrity with which it was made. Hours passed, and the table began to take shape. He fitted the legs to the apron, using mortise and tenon joints, the kind that required patience and precision, that could not be rushed, that would hold firm for generations if done properly. He sanded the surfaces smooth, feeling the wood transform under his hands from rough to silken, revealing the beauty of the grain, the way light would play across it, the warmth it would bring to whatever space it occupied. He applied a first coat of oil, watching as the wood darkened slightly, as its character deepened, as it became more fully itself. By the time he stopped for the night, it was past midnight, and he was tired in the good way, the satisfying way that came from productive effort. The table was not finished, but it was well begun, and he could see clearly what it would become. He cleaned his tools carefully, wiped down his work surfaces, and swept up the sawdust, collecting it in a paper bag to dispose of properly. Then he washed his hands, the water running brown with wood dust, and he made himself a simple dinner of bread and cheese and leftover soup, eating standing at the counter, his body pleasantly tired, his mind quiet and clear. Before he went to bed, he stood looking at the partially completed table, at the work of his hands, at the evidence of his capability and creativity. And he felt something that surprised him, something unexpected and powerful. He felt proud, not in an arrogant way, but in the simple, honest recognition that he had value, that his skills mattered, that he could create beauty and utility regardless of whether a bank believed in him or not, regardless of whether anyone gave him permission or approval or financial backing. He could do this. He was doing this. And that realization, arriving gently in the quiet hours of night, felt like a kind of freedom, a release from waiting, from depending on external validation, from measuring his worth by others' standards. Sleep came easily that night, deep and restorative, untroubled by worry or disappointment. Dmitri dreamed of forests, of tall trees with dappled light filtering through their canopy, of wood grain like rivers flowing in slow patterns, of tools that fit his hands perfectly, of creating things that would last beyond his lifetime, that would carry something of his spirit into the future, that would serve and delight people he would never meet. The dreams were peaceful, unhurried, full of warmth and possibility. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Dmitri continued his construction work during the day, framing houses and hanging drywall. His labor steady and reliable, earning the wages that kept him fed and housed and able to save, slowly, incrementally, toward an uncertain future. But his evenings and weekends became dedicated to his own work, to building furniture piece by piece in his small apartment workshop. He finished the side table and was immediately pleased with it, more pleased than he had been with anything he had made in years. It was beautiful in its simplicity, sturdy and well-proportioned, with a finish that invited touch, that made you want to run your hand across its surface just to feel the smoothness, the warmth of the wood. He took photographs of the table from multiple angles, capturing how light moved across its surface, how shadows defined its edges, how it transformed the space it occupied. Then he posted these photographs online, on social media platforms where people in Bellhaven gathered to share recommendations and sell items and connect with their neighbors. He wrote a simple description explaining that he was a craftsman offering custom furniture, that this piece was available for purchase, and that he could create similar work on commission. He kept his prices modest, lower than what such craftsmanship was worth, because he was unknown, unproven in this market, and because he wanted to build relationships more than profit, wanted to establish trust, wanted his work to speak for itself in homes throughout the community. The response came slowly at first. A few people liked the post, left encouraging comments. Then someone shared it to another group, then another. Within a week, Dmitri received his first inquiry, a message from a woman named Patricia Sullivan, who lived on the east side of town and was interested in a coffee table for her living room. She asked about his process, his timeline, his materials. He responded carefully, his English improving with practice, explaining his approach, his commitment to sustainability, his attention to detail. They arranged to meet, and he brought sketches and wood samples to her home, a modest bungalow with a garden full of roses and a porch that wrapped around two sides. Patricia was in her 60s, with silver hair cut short and practical, with gardening dirt under her fingernails and laugh lines around her eyes. She made them tea, and they sat at her kitchen table, discussing what she wanted, what would work in her space, what wood species she preferred. She had been skeptical when first reaching out, uncertain about buying furniture from someone unknown, but in person, talking with Dmitri, seeing his sketches, hearing his thoughtfulness about each decision, she felt reassured. There was something trustworthy in his manner, something genuine in his enthusiasm, something that made her feel she could take a chance on him, that this was a person who would honor his commitments, who took pride in doing work well. They agreed on a design and a price, and Dmitri walked home that evening with a deposit check in his pocket and a sense of possibility expanding in his chest. He had his first commission. Someone had chosen to trust him, to invest in his vision, to believe that what he could create would have value in her life. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of things, just a coffee table, but it felt enormous. Felt like a validation that was more meaningful than any bank approval could have been because it came from a real person who had looked at his work and said yes. He built Patricia's coffee table over the next 3 weeks, working carefully, mindfully, channeling all his skill and attention into its creation. He selected walnut for its warmth and depth, for the way its grain moved like water, for its durability. He designed it with a lower shelf for books and a smooth top that would be perfect for resting teacups and displaying small treasures. Every joint was precise, every surface finished to a satin smoothness that invited touch. When it was complete, he wrapped it carefully and delivered it himself, carrying it up her front walk and into her living room, where the afternoon light from her windows fell across it in golden streams. Patricia's face when she saw it placed in her space, when she ran her hand across its surface, when she stepped back to admire how perfectly it fit, was something Dmitri knew he would remember always. She was delighted, more than delighted, moved almost to tears by the beauty of it, by how it transformed her room, by how it felt exactly right, like it had always belonged there. She insisted he stay for coffee, and they sat together in her living room, the new table between them holding their cups, and she told him about her late husband who had also loved well-made things, who had collected tools that now sat unused in her garage, who would have appreciated Dmitri's craftsmanship. There was something healing in this exchange, something that went beyond a simple business transaction, a connection between two people who understood that objects could carry meaning, that beauty and utility were not luxuries but necessities, that the things we surround ourselves with shape the quality of our lives. Word spread. Patricia told her friends, showed them photographs, invited them over specifically to see the table. Each visitor admired it, asked where she had found it, wrote down Dmitri's information. Within a month, he had 3 more commissions: a bookshelf for a retired teacher, a dining table for a young couple expecting their first child, a bench for an elderly man who wanted to place it under the oak tree in his backyard where he liked to sit in the mornings with his newspaper and coffee. Dmitri worked steadily, patiently, building each piece with the same care and attention, never cutting corners, never rushing, always honoring the integrity of his craft. His apartment became increasingly filled with sawdust and wood shavings, despite his best efforts to keep things tidy, and he worried sometimes about bothering Mrs. Chen downstairs, but she only smiled when he apologized, told him the smell of sawdust reminded her of her father's workshop, that she found it comforting rather than annoying. The seasons shifted, summer giving way to autumn, and Bellhaven transformed in shades of amber and rust, the trees along the streets dropping leaves that collected in drifts against curbs and fences, the air taking on a crisp edge that made warm sweaters necessary, that made the light more golden, more precious as the days shortened. Dmitri worked through these changes, his hands growing more confident, his reputation growing quietly, steadily, through word of mouth and satisfied customers who returned to commission additional pieces, who referred him to family members and neighbors. He began to save money again, more money than before, because the furniture business was generating income that supplemented his construction wages. He kept the coffee tin on the shelf, adding bills to it weekly, watching it grow heavier with possibility, but his dreams had shifted slightly. He no longer thought as much about the empty garage on the corner lot, about establishing a formal workshop space. Instead, he found himself content with this smaller scale, with working in his apartment, with the intimacy of his current setup. There was something right about it, something that fit who he was and how he wanted to move through the world, without the pressure and overhead of a formal business, without the complications of loans and rent and business licenses. Still, he needed more space eventually, if only to store materials and completed pieces waiting for delivery. And so, one Saturday morning in late October, when the fog was thick and soft and the sound of foghorns carried from the harbor, he decided to walk through Bellhaven looking for storage solutions, for small sheds or garages that might be available to rent inexpensively. His wandering took him away from the main commercial district, into the residential neighborhoods that climbed the hill above the harbor, where older homes with established gardens sat on larger lots, where the streets were quieter and the pace even more relaxed. He walked slowly, noticing details, appreciating the architecture, the way different eras of building styles sat side by side, the Victorian homes with their elaborate trim next to modest craftsman bungalows, next to modern builds that tried to fit into the established aesthetic with varying degrees of success. He found himself on a street called Rosewood Lane, where maple trees formed a canopy overhead, and the sidewalks were buckled and cracked by roots that had grown strong over decades. Near the end of the street, almost where it dead-ended into a wooded area that bordered the town's greenbelt, he noticed a property that caught his attention. It was different from the others, set back further from the street, approached by a gravel driveway that curved between overgrown rhododendrons. The house itself was barely visible, hidden behind trees and neglect, but at the front of the property, facing the street, stood a building that made his heart quicken with interest. It was a workshop, clearly, or had been once. A substantial structure built of cedar that had weathered to silver gray, with large windows along one side and a roll-up door on the front, that suggested it had been used for automotive work, or perhaps as an artist's studio. It looked abandoned, unused for years, with ivy growing up one wall and leaves piled against its foundation. But the roof appeared intact, the structure sound, and even from the street he could sense its potential, could imagine what it could become with cleaning and care, with someone who would appreciate it, who would bring it back to purposeful life. There was no for-lease sign, no indication that it was available. The property had an air of long emptiness, of being forgotten, of waiting for something or someone to remember it existed. Dmitri stood at the end of the driveway for a long time, looking at the workshop, feeling drawn to it in a way he could not quite explain, a pull that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place he had never been before. He walked up the driveway slowly, his boots crunching on gravel that was half covered with moss, and he approached the workshop carefully, respectfully, as one might approach a sleeping animal, not wanting to startle or disturb. The windows were dusty but unbroken, and when he cupped his hands around his eyes and peered through, he could see the interior, empty but spacious, with exposed beam ceiling and concrete floor and electrical boxes on the walls that suggested it had been properly wired at some point. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. Exactly what he would have designed if he could have created his ideal workspace from imagination alone. He walked around the building, noting details, seeing how it sat on the property, how light would enter at different times of day, how the trees would provide shade in summer while allowing light in winter when their leaves fell. Behind the workshop, the main house stood partially hidden, a Victorian structure that had seen better days, its paint peeling, its porch sagging, its gardens grown wild with blackberry vines and tangled roses. There was no sign of occupancy, no cars in the driveway, no curtains in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. It looked like no one had lived there for years, like the property had been abandoned or forgotten, left to slowly return to the forest that pressed against its boundaries. Dmitri felt a strange mix of emotions standing there. Excitement at finding such a perfect space, sadness at seeing it unused and deteriorating, curiosity about its history and why it sat empty, and a longing that was almost painful, a desire to somehow make this place his, to restore it, to fill it with purpose and activity and creation. But it was not for lease, and he had no way of knowing who owned it or whether they might be willing to rent it, and so he stood there in the October fog, breathing in the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys, letting himself imagine for just a moment before preparing to walk away. He was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him, a gentle voice that startled him nonetheless because he had been so absorbed in his thoughts that he had not heard anyone approach. He turned quickly, apologetically, ready to explain that he was not trespassing, that he was just looking, that he meant no harm. The person who had spoken was a woman, elderly, perhaps in her 80s, small and slight, with white hair pulled back in a loose bun, with eyes that were faded blue but still sharp, observant, kind. She wore a long wool coat that looked vintage, expensive once but worn now, and she carried a walking stick that she leaned on lightly, more for balance on the uneven ground than from necessity. She had appeared from the direction of the main house, materializing out of the fog like a character from a story. And she was looking at Dmitri with curiosity, but without fear or suspicion. She asked if she could help him, and her voice was refined, educated, with the particular accent of someone who had been born to privilege, who had received the kind of schooling that shaped vowels and consonants into precise, elegant sounds. Dmitri apologized immediately, explained that he had been walking, that he had noticed the workshop, that he had not meant to intrude. His English was nervous, stumbling, and he could feel his accent thickening with embarrassment, his words tangling. The woman smiled, a gentle expression that reached her eyes, and she waved away his apologies with her free hand. She told him not to worry, that the property was not posted, that she did not mind people looking, that in fact she was glad someone had noticed it at all. She introduced herself as Eleanor Whitmore, and she asked his name, and when he told her, she repeated it carefully, getting the pronunciation right, treating it with respect rather than anglicizing it for her own convenience. They stood together in the fog, an unlikely pair, and she asked what had drawn him to the property. Dmitri explained, his words coming more easily as he relaxed, about his furniture work, about looking for storage or workspace, about how perfect this building seemed for his needs. Eleanor listened attentively, her expression thoughtful, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she began to tell him a story, speaking in that gentle, unhurried way that elderly people have when they are sharing something important, something they want to get right. She told him that this property had been her family home for over 60 years, that she had raised her children here, that her husband had used that very workshop for his own projects, that he had been an architect who loved to build furniture in his spare time, who had installed the large windows specifically to capture north light, who had spent countless happy hours there creating things with his hands. Her husband had passed away 15 years ago, she explained, and her children had moved away, scattered across the country with their own families and careers. She had continued to live in the house for a while, but eventually it had become too much for her to maintain. Alone, too many rooms, too many memories, too many stairs for aging knees. She had moved to a retirement community in the next town over, a comfortable place with a small apartment and meals provided and people her age for company. She had meant to sell this property. had listed it with a realtor several times, but somehow it had never sold. The house needed extensive work, the property required care, and the price, while fair, was more than most buyers wanted to invest in something that demanded so much attention. So it had sat empty, visited occasionally by her or her son who lived several hours away, maintained minimally to prevent complete decay, but essentially abandoned, waiting for a purpose that had not yet revealed itself. She came by sometimes, she said, especially on foggy mornings like this, because it reminded her of the early days of her marriage, of raising young children, of the life she had lived here that felt both distant and immediate, like something that had happened both centuries ago and just yesterday. Dmitri listened to this story with a growing sense of something he could not quite name, a feeling that this encounter was not random, that there was a rightness to it, a sense of pieces fitting together in ways that seemed both impossible and inevitable. When Eleanor finished speaking, he found himself asking, almost before he could stop himself, whether she might consider renting the workshop, just the workshop, not the house, just the small building that her husband had loved. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, looking at the workshop, then at Dmitri, then back at the workshop, her expression thoughtful, considering. The fog swirled around them, muting sounds, creating a sense of privacy, of being removed from the ordinary world, of existing in a space where different rules might apply, where unusual arrangements might become possible. Finally, she spoke. She said that she had never considered renting just the workshop, that it had always been part of the whole property in her mind, inseparable from the house and land. But hearing him talk about his work, about building furniture, about craftsmanship and care, she found herself thinking that her husband would have liked that, would have approved of the space being used for such purposes, would have been pleased to know it was serving creativity again rather than sitting empty and purposeless. She proposed something unexpected. She said he could use the workshop, that she would not charge rent initially, that they could consider it a trial period, a few months to see if it worked, to see if he could make use of it, to see if they could trust each other. In exchange, she asked only that he help maintain the property somewhat, keep the driveway cleared, perhaps trim back some of the vegetation that was encroaching on the buildings, small tasks that her son tried to manage but that were difficult from a distance. If after a few months they both felt it was working, they could formalize an arrangement, establish a fair rent, make it official. Dmitri could hardly believe what he was hearing. It was too generous, too trusting, too perfect. He tried to protest, to insist on paying rent from the beginning to establish proper terms. But Eleanor was firm in her gentle way, explaining that money was not her concern, that she had enough for her needs, that what mattered to her was seeing the space used well, honored, given purpose again. She had lived long enough, she said, to trust her instincts about people, and she had a good feeling about him, could see in his manner and in the way he had looked at the workshop that he would treat it with respect, that he understood what it meant to create things that lasted, that mattered. They exchanged contact information, and Eleanor gave him a key to the workshop, an old brass key that was warm from her pocket, that felt significant in his palm, weighted with more than just metal. She told him he could start whenever he was ready, that there was no rush, that the building had waited this long and could wait a little longer. Then she walked slowly back toward the house, her walking stick tapping on the gravel, her figure fading into the fog until she disappeared entirely, leaving Dmitri standing alone with a key in his hand and a feeling in his chest that was somewhere between joy and disbelief and profound gratitude. He let himself into the workshop using the key, the lock turning smoothly despite years of disuse, the door opening on hinges that creaked but held firm. The interior smelled of aged wood and dust and faintly of motor oil from decades past, and the light filtering through the dirty windows was soft and even, exactly as good as he had imagined. He walked slowly through the space, his footsteps echoing on concrete, his eyes taking in every detail, every possibility. There was so much room, more room than he had dreamed of, enough space for proper workbenches, for tool storage, for lumber racks, for a finishing area separate from the cutting area, for everything he had imagined, and more. He spent the rest of that day cleaning, unable to wait, too excited to postpone beginning. He swept decades of accumulated dust and leaves and debris, watching clouds of it billow out the door into the fog. He cleaned the windows until they were transparent again, until light poured through them unobstructed. He tested the electrical outlets and found most of them still functional. He examined the structure carefully, looking for rot or damage, finding instead solid construction, good bones, evidence of quality work done by someone who cared about building things properly. By evening, when the fog had lifted and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the workshop was transformed. It was still empty, still needing equipment and furnishing, but it was clean, ready, waiting to be filled with purpose. Dmitri stood in the doorway looking at what he had accomplished in just hours, and he felt something shift inside him, a settling, a sense of arriving somewhere he was meant to be, of finding a place that fit him, that welcomed him, that would support the work he needed to do. Over the following weeks, he gradually moved his operation from his apartment to the workshop. He brought his tools, installing pegboards and racks to organize them properly. He built workbenches from reclaimed lumber, sturdy surfaces that would support his projects. He created a lumber storage system, racks that kept wood organized by species and size, keeping it dry and accessible. He installed better lighting, bright LED fixtures that eliminated shadows and made detailed work easier. He brought in a small space heater for the cold months, and he set up a radio that played classical music softly while he worked, creating an atmosphere that was both focused and peaceful. The workshop became his sanctuary, his creative space, the physical manifestation of his dreams. And true to his word, he cared for the property as he had promised Eleanor. He cleared the driveway of debris, trimmed back the encroaching vegetation, repaired a section of fence that had fallen. He even began, with Eleanor's permission, to care for some of the gardens, cutting back the blackberry vines, rescuing the roses that had been choked by weeds, revealing flower beds that had once been tended with love but had been abandoned to entropy. Eleanor visited occasionally, appearing without warning on foggy mornings or sunny afternoons, always walking slowly up the driveway with her stick, always greeting him warmly. She would sit on an old chair he had restored for her, watching him work, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, content just to be in the space her husband had loved, to see it alive again with creative activity. She brought him tea sometimes, in a thermos that she carried carefully, and homemade cookies that reminded him of his grandmother, and they would take breaks together, talking about his projects, about her memories, about the changing seasons, about nothing in particular, building a friendship that was unexpected and precious, that enriched both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. His business grew steadily, more commissions arrived, more complex projects, higher-end pieces for clients who appreciated quality and were willing to pay for craftsmanship. He raised his prices gradually, bringing them more in line with the value of his work, no longer undercharging out of insecurity or doubt. He established relationships with local suppliers, with lumber yards that specialized in sustainable hardwoods, with finishing supply companies that provided environmentally friendly products. He even began teaching, offering occasional workshops where he showed others basic woodworking skills, sharing his knowledge generously, paying forward the help he had received from patient coworkers and kind customers. The anniversary of his loan rejection came and went, unmarked, unremarked, almost forgotten. So much had changed in that year. So much had unfolded in ways he could not have predicted or planned. What had seemed like a door closing had actually been a gentle push toward a different path, one that ultimately proved more aligned with who he was and how he wanted to live. One winter afternoon, almost 18 months after he had first walked onto Eleanor's property, as he was working on a cherry wood dresser for a client in town, he heard voices outside the workshop, multiple voices, unfamiliar, speaking in tones that suggested official business, important matters. He set down his tools and went to the door, stepping out into cold December air that smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. 3 people stood in the driveway, conferring among themselves. 2 men in suits, carrying briefcases and documents, and Eleanor, looking smaller and more fragile than he had seen her before, her expression troubled, distressed. When she saw Dmitri, her face showed relief, and she called to him, asked if he could join them, if he had a moment. The men introduced themselves as Richard Pemberton and David Chen, representing the Bellhaven Community Bank and the town's development authority, respectively. Dmitri recognized Richard's name immediately, remembered sitting across from him in that windowless office, receiving his rejection, being told that his business plan was too risky, his credentials too thin. Richard did not seem to remember him, or if he did, he gave no indication. His attention focused on the papers he held, on whatever official business had brought them here. They explained the situation, speaking in careful, professional language. The property, through a complex series of circumstances involving back taxes and estate issues that Eleanor's son had apparently not been managing properly, was being evaluated for foreclosure proceedings. The bank held a lien, and the development authority was interested in the land for a planned expansion of the Greenbelt Park system. Eleanor was being offered a settlement, a price that was described as fair, but that Dmitri could see from her face was far less than the property was worth, far less than what it meant to her beyond monetary value. She had come today to retrieve some items from the house, they explained, and they were conducting a property assessment, taking photographs, documenting conditions. The workshop, they noted, appeared to be in use, and they asked about that, questioned who was operating a business on property that was effectively in default, whether proper permits and licenses were in place, whether zoning regulations were being followed. Dmitri felt a cold knot of worry form in his stomach. He had been operating in good faith, with Eleanor's permission, but they had never formalized anything, never established official rental agreements, never filed business permits because he had been thinking of it as a temporary arrangement, as something casual that might evolve into something more official eventually. He began to explain, his accent thickening with nervousness, his words stumbling over themselves. But before he could say much, Eleanor stepped forward, her spine straightening, her small frame somehow commanding despite its frailty. She spoke in a voice that was quiet but firm, with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in a particular social class, who knew how to speak to men like these, who understood the language of property and law and social standing. She explained that Dmitri was her tenant, that he had been maintaining the property as part of his rental agreement, that his work was legitimate and authorized, that any questions about permits or zoning should be directed to her, not to him, and that she would appreciate them not harassing someone who was simply conducting honest business on property she still legally owned until any foreclosure was actually finalized. The men were taken aback by her firmness, by the steel underneath her gentle elderly woman exterior. They apologized, said they meant no harassment, that they were simply conducting due diligence, that they understood she retained ownership until the legal process concluded. They took their photographs, made their notes, and then they left, their cars crunching down the gravel driveway, leaving Eleanor and Dmitri standing together in the cold afternoon. She looked tired, he noticed, more tired than he had ever seen her, and there were tears in her eyes that she tried to hide by turning away, by pretending to examine the workshop door. He asked gently if she was all right, if there was anything he could do, and she shook her head. But he could see she was not all right, that this situation was weighing on her, that the thought of losing this property, of seeing it taken away and turned into something else, was breaking her heart in quiet, dignified ways she would never fully express. They went inside the workshop, and he made her tea on the small hot plate he kept there, and they sat together while the light faded outside, while the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down, soft and silent. She talked, needing to talk, about how her son had promised to handle the property taxes and paperwork, about how she had trusted him but had not been vigilant enough, about how complicated things became at her age, how difficult it was to keep track of all the details, how easy it was for things to slip through cracks, to be forgotten or neglected. She spoke about what the property meant to her, about the memories it held, about how her husband had loved this land, how her children had grown up here, how she had imagined it staying in the family forever, being passed down to grandchildren, maintaining continuity across generations. The thought of it being taken, being absorbed into a public park where strangers would walk without knowing the stories, the love, the life that had happened. Here felt like a kind of death, like an erasure of something precious and irreplaceable. Dmitri listened, his heart aching for her, wishing he could help but not knowing how, feeling helpless and angry at systems that could do this, that could take away someone's home, someone's history, reducing decades of life to line items on financial statements, to property assessments and tax records. He thought about his own rejection from the bank, about how Richard Pemberton had sat across from him and made calculations that reduced his dreams to risk assessments and credit scores, and he felt a familiar frustration, a sense of being measured by metrics that missed what actually mattered, that could not see value that existed outside their narrow definitions. When Eleanor finally left that evening, getting into her car slowly, carefully, promising to let him know what happened next, Dmitri stood in his workshop surrounded by his tools and his projects and his slowly built success, and he felt the fragility of it all, how quickly things could change, how little security anyone really had, how the structures that seemed solid could collapse, could be taken away, could disappear like fog lifting. That night, in his apartment above the bakery, he could not settle, could not focus on anything, could not quiet the churning of his thoughts. He kept thinking about Eleanor, about the property, about the workshop that had become so important to him, about the unfairness of situations like this where people who had worked hard, who had played by the rules, who had built lives of meaning and value, could still lose everything to technicalities and systems that operated without compassion, without consideration of individual circumstances. And he thought about what he could do, if anything. He was just a furniture maker, an immigrant with modest savings and no particular influence or connections. What power did he have to affect situations like this? What difference could one person make against banks and development authorities and legal processes already in motion? But as he sat in his small apartment, as the night deepened and the town grew quiet around him, as the smell of tomorrow's bread began to drift up from the bakery below, an idea formed slowly in his mind, tentative at first, then growing clearer, more solid, more possible. It was ambitious, probably foolish, almost certainly destined to fail, but it was something, an action he could take, a way to try to help, to at least make an attempt, rather than standing by helplessly while things happened around him. He began to make notes, to sketch out a plan, to calculate numbers, to think through possibilities and obstacles. He worked late into the night, and when he finally slept, it was briefly and restlessly, his mind still churning with ideas, with hope and fear mixed together, with the determination of someone who had been knocked down before and had learned to get back up, to keep trying, to refuse, to accept defeat until defeat became absolutely unavoidable. The next morning, he called in sick to his construction job for the first time in years, and he went instead to the Bellhaven Community Bank, walking into the same building where he had been rejected 18 months before, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. He asked to see Richard Pemberton, and he waited in the same seating area, in the same worn leather chairs, but this time with different documents in his folder, a different purpose in his mind. When Richard called him back to his office, there was still no recognition in his face, no memory of their previous meeting, which told Dmitri something about how many people passed through that office, how many applications and rejections occurred, how unmemorable most of them were to the person making the decisions, even when they represented life-changing moments for the people being judged. Dmitri sat down and explained why he had come. He wanted to make an offer on Eleanor Whitmore's property, to assume her debt, to prevent the foreclosure. He had savings, not much, but some, enough for a down payment if the bank would work with him. More importantly, he had a thriving business now, with steady income, with a growing client base, with established relationships in the community. He had documentation, records of sales, tax returns, references from satisfied customers, photographs of his work. He had everything he should have had 18 months ago, plus the track record of success that proved he was capable, that his business model worked, that he was a good risk. Richard looked through the documents slowly, methodically, his expression professional but not encouraging. When he finished, he set them down and folded his hands on top of them in exactly the same gesture he had used before, and Dmitri felt a sinking sensation, a familiar disappointment rising to meet him. Richard explained, in careful language, that while Dmitri's business success was commendable, while his documentation was much improved, the situation with the Whitmore property was complicated. The amount owed was substantial, including back taxes and interest and fees. The property needed extensive work, which would affect its value and insurability. Most importantly, there were already parties interested in the property, with the development authority having right of first refusal in cases of foreclosure, and the bank had obligations to those existing arrangements, commitments made that could not simply be set aside for an alternative offer. He spoke gently, almost apologetically, but the message was clear. Dmitri's offer, while appreciated, was not going to be accepted. The process was too far along, the complications too numerous, the existing agreements too binding. He suggested that Dmitri might want to look for other properties, other workshops, that surely there were other spaces available that would serve his needs, that did not come with such complicated legal and financial entanglements. Dmitri listened with a heaviness in his chest, with frustration that he tried to keep from showing in his face, with a sense of how little power he actually had in situations like this, how much the world operated according to rules and systems that he could not change or circumvent, no matter how hard he worked or how legitimate his needs. He thanked Richard for his time, gathered his documents, and left, walking out into a cold December morning where snow was falling more heavily now, accumulating on sidewalks and cars, transforming the town into something beautiful and temporary, like all beautiful things that could not last. He went to the workshop, needing to be there, needing to be surrounded by his work, by the evidence of what he had built. He started a fire in the small wood stove he had installed, and he sat watching the flames while snow fell outside the windows, while the world grew white and quiet. And he thought about Eleanor, about how to tell her he had tried and failed, about how her property would be lost, about how the workshop he had come to love, that had become his home in ways more profound than his apartment had ever been, would be taken away, would cease to exist as a place of creation and become instead part of a public park, its history erased, its purpose forgotten. He was still sitting there, still lost in these dark thoughts, when he heard a car on the driveway, footsteps approaching. He assumed it was Eleanor, come to check on the property or perhaps to retrieve more items before the foreclosure finalized, and he prepared himself to share his bad news, to admit his failure. But when the door opened, it was not Eleanor. It was a younger man, perhaps in his 50s, well-dressed in expensive casual clothes, with Eleanor's blue eyes and her refined features, recognizable as her son, though they had never met. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, and he asked if he could speak with Dmitri for a few minutes, if this was a good time. They sat together near the wood stove, and Thomas began to talk, slowly at first, then with increasing emotion, with the kind of honesty that comes when someone has been holding something inside for too long and finally needs to release it. He explained that he had learned about the foreclosure only recently, that he had been traveling internationally for work and had not been paying proper attention to the property management, that he had made assumptions and mistakes that had led to this situation. He felt terrible about it, about letting his mother down, about failing to protect something she valued, about being so absorbed in his own life that he had neglected responsibilities that should have been priorities. But he had also learned something else recently, something his mother had mentioned in passing during a phone call, something that had stuck with him, that had made him curious enough to investigate. She had told him about the immigrant furniture maker who was using his father's workshop, who was building beautiful things there, who reminded her of her husband in his dedication to craft, in his respect for materials, in his gentle manner and thoughtful approach to work. Thomas had looked into this, had asked around in Bellhaven, had spoken with some of Dmitri's customers, had seen photographs of his work, and he had become aware, through these inquiries, of how respected Dmitri was becoming in the community, how his furniture was treasured by those who owned it, how his story, an immigrant building a business through skill and determination, resonated with people, represented something they valued about their town, about giving people chances, about recognizing talent regardless of where it came from. And Thomas had also learned, though Dmitri had not mentioned this to Eleanor, about the rejected loan application, about how Dmitri had tried to help save the property, about how he had gone to the bank with an offer, only to be turned down again. This information had come from Jennifer at the bank, the receptionist with kind eyes, who had remembered Dmitri from his first visit, who had been moved by his return, by his attempt to help someone else even though he had been refused help himself, and who had mentioned it to a friend, who had mentioned it to someone else until the story made its way back to Thomas through the complicated web of small-town connections. Thomas explained all this to Dmitri, speaking with emotion that was barely controlled, with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to what Dmitri had actually done, which was merely try and fail. But Thomas saw it differently, saw Dmitri's attempt as significant, as meaningful, as representative of character and values that deserved to be honored and supported. And so Thomas had made decisions, had taken actions, had used his own resources and connections to address the situation. He had paid off the back taxes and fees, had settled the bank's lien, had stopped the foreclosure process. The property was secure, safe, no longer at risk. His mother could keep it for as long as she wanted, or she could sell it when she was ready, on her own terms, without pressure or deadlines imposed by financial institutions or development authorities. More than that, Thomas wanted to formalize Dmitri's arrangement with the property. He wanted to establish a proper lease for the workshop, with terms that were fair and secure, that would give Dmitri the stability to continue building his business without fear of losing his space. And he wanted to help with the maintenance and restoration of the property, to honor his father's memory, to preserve what his parents had built, to acknowledge that places had meaning beyond their financial value, that history and connection and love mattered too, that not everything should be measured in dollars or reduced to transactions. Dmitri listened to all this with a feeling of unreality, of being in a dream where impossible things happened, where problems resolved themselves in ways that seemed too convenient, too neat, like stories rather than life. He struggled to find words, his English failing him not from lack of vocabulary but from surfeit of emotion, from trying to express gratitude and relief and amazement all at once. Thomas brushed aside his thanks, said it was he who should be grateful, that Dmitri had cared for his mother, had given new life to his father's workshop, had tried to help when he had no obligation to do so, when he could easily have simply found another space and moved on. That kind of integrity, that kind of loyalty, was rare and precious and deserved to be recognized and supported. They talked for a long time that afternoon, while the snow continued falling outside, while the fire crackled in the stove, while the workshop that had seemed lost became secure again, became truly Dmitri's in a way it had not been before, with the blessing and support of the family who had built it, who understood what it meant, who wanted to see it continue serving the purposes for which it had been created. When Thomas finally left, promising to return soon with the lease documents and to introduce Dmitri properly to the lawyers who would handle everything, Dmitri sat alone in the gathering darkness, in his workshop that now felt even more like home, and he let tears come, quiet tears of relief and gratitude and recognition that life sometimes bent in unexpected directions, that kindness existed, that help appeared in surprising forms, that the universe occasionally corrected itself in ways that felt like grace. Eleanor came by the next day, having heard from Thomas, and they sat together in the winter sunshine that streamed through the workshop windows, not saying much, just baying together, sharing the quiet satisfaction of a crisis averted, of things working out, of goodness prevailing in a small but significant way. She brought more cookies, and they had tea, and she told him stories about her husband, about the furniture he had built in this very space, about how he would have liked Dmitri, would have enjoyed talking with him about joinery and wood species and finishing techniques, would have been pleased to know that his workshop had found someone worthy to carry on its tradition. The winter passed peacefully, productively. Dmitri's business continued to grow, his reputation spreading beyond Bellhaven into neighboring communities. He hired an apprentice, a young woman named Maya who had dropped out of engineering school, who had discovered she preferred working with her hands to working with computers, who learned quickly and brought her own creativity and perspective to the work. The workshop filled with the sounds of two people working in harmony, of tools and laughter and occasional mistakes that became learning opportunities, of mentorship flowing both directions, as often happens when teaching and learning occur simultaneously. Eleanor visited regularly, bringing friends sometimes, proud to show them what was happening on her property, what had become of the space her husband had loved. She would sit in her chair, wrapped in blankets when the weather was cold, content to watch the work, to be part of the creative energy, to feel that the property was alive again, serving purposes that aligned with its history, that honored its past while building its future, and sometimes Richard Pemberton from the bank would drive past the property, on his way to somewhere else, and he would notice the workshop with its lights on, with people moving inside, with evidence of thriving activity. And maybe he wondered about it, or maybe he didn't, maybe it did not register at all. Maybe it was just another building in a town full of buildings, another small business among many, unremarkable, unmemorable, not worth his attention or consideration. But for Dmitri, for Eleanor, for Thomas, for the growing list of customers who owned furniture built in that workshop, for Maya learning her craft, for the community members who took Dmitri's occasional classes, for all these people, the workshop was significant, was meaningful, was proof that value existed outside of credit scores and financial projections, that human connection and mutual support could accomplish what institutions could not or would not, that dignity and worth were not determined by paperwork or approvals, but by character and contribution, by how you treated others, by what you created and how you moved through the world. The seasons turned, spring arriving with cherry blossoms and longer days, summer bringing warmth and the smell of roses from the gardens that Dmitri continued to restore. The business thrived, growing at a sustainable pace, never becoming so large that it lost its essential character, never expanding beyond what could be maintained with attention to quality, with commitment to craft, with the integrity that had defined it from the beginning. And on quiet mornings, when Dmitri would arrive early at the workshop, when fog still hung in the trees and the town was just waking, when he would unlock the door and step into the space that had become his sanctuary and his livelihood, he would sometimes remember that day at the bank, that rejection that had felt like defeat, that closed door that had forced him to find another way. And he would feel, in those moments, something like gratitude for that rejection, for how it had pushed him toward building something on his own terms, toward finding this place, toward meeting Eleanor and Thomas, toward creating a business and a life that fit who he actually was, rather than who he thought he needed to be to satisfy someone else's criteria. The rejection had not defined him. The loan officer's decision had not determined his worth. The bank's assessment had been wrong, not about the risks, perhaps, but about what was possible, about what could be built through determination and skill and community support, about the value that existed outside their metrics and measurements. He had built his business anyway, not in spite of being denied, but perhaps because of it, forced to be more creative, more resourceful, more connected to the actual work rather than to the infrastructure of official entrepreneurship. And what he had built was more authentic, more aligned with his values, more sustainable in ways that went beyond financial projections to include meaning and purpose and contribution to something larger than himself. The workshop filled gradually with natural morning light as the fog lifted, and Dmitri moved among his tools and his projects with the ease of someone who had found their place and who had discovered where they belonged, who had learned that home was not about papers or approvals or official recognition, but about doing work that mattered, about treating people with respect, about creating beauty and utility, about moving through the world with integrity even when the world did not seem to notice or care. And in this space, in this workshop with its history and its promise, surrounded by the smell of wood and the tools of his craft, Dmitri continued his work, building furniture that would last for generations, that would carry something of his care and attention into homes throughout the community, that would serve and delight long after he was gone. That would be his legacy not because anyone had given him permission, but because he had given himself permission, had claimed his own worth, had built his own path when the official paths were closed. The story of the immigrant who was denied a loan, who built his business anyway, who ended up saving the property he worked in, who found family and purpose in unexpected places, was told and retold in Bellhaven, growing with each telling, becoming part of the town's collection of stories about itself, about the kind of place it wanted to be, about the values it held. Some details were exaggerated, some were simplified, some were probably wrong, but the essential truth remained. The core of what mattered, which was that people could help each other, that systems did not have final say over possibilities, that worth existed independent of approval, that beauty and meaning could be created through work and dedication and respect for craft. And Dmitri, at the center of this story, remained humble, remained focused on his work, remained grateful for his customers and his community and his workshop and the unlikely family he had found in Eleanor and Thomas, remained committed to doing each day what he had always done, which was to show up, to work carefully, to treat materials and people with respect, to build things that would last, to move through the world gently, adding more than he took, creating more than he consumed, leaving things better than he found them. The afternoon light slanted through the windows in golden. Bars and dust motes danced in the beams, and the workshop was warm and full of purpose, and outside the gardens bloomed with flowers that Eleanor had planted decades ago, that Dmitri had rescued from neglect, that now flourished again, cared for, tended, given the attention they needed to thrive. And in this moment, in this place, with the sounds of work and the smell of wood and the satisfaction of creation, there was peace, there was meaning, there was the quiet joy of a life being lived with intention and integrity, of dreams being realized not according to anyone else's timeline or approval, but according to the slow, steady accumulation of effort and care and commitment that built something real, something lasting, something that mattered. The universe had not corrected itself dramatically, had not delivered justice through grand gestures or spectacular reversals. Instead, it had worked through small acts of kindness, through Eleanor's trust, through Thomas's gratitude, through customers who recognized quality, through community members who supported local craftspeople, through all the tiny connections and considerations that made up the fabric of a life, that wove individual stories into the larger story of a place and its people. And Dmitri, who had arrived in this country with nothing but hope and skills and determination, who had been rejected and dismissed and measured inadequate by people who did not know him, who had built something anyway, piece by piece, day by day, through patience and persistence and refusal to accept that someone else's no meant the end of possibility, stood in his workshop as the day faded into evening, as the light softened and grew golden, as another day of good work came to a gentle close, and he was content, was grateful, was home.